Alright guys, we're going to go over body cavities and membranes. The first thing we're going to do is talk about cavities and what a cavity is. And if you think about a cavity in your tooth, it's just a hole. And so the cavities of the body are going to be the same thing. It is just a hole or a space where organs are found. And if we look at this picture, a hole doesn't necessarily have to be shallow. It can be a space, or think about your cranial cavity or where your brain would be found. It would be more like a bowl or a sphere where some organs can be found. And so what we're going to do first is split the body up into a cavity that is on the back side and a cavity that is on the front side. Or if we go back to the notes from the other day, the back side is posterior, the front side is anterior. And so the cavity that would be found on the posterior portion of the body is your dorsal body cavity. And the term dorsal is also the same thing as posterior, so that would make sense. On the front side of the body, or the ventral or anterior portion of the body, we have the ventral body cavity, which is composed of number 4, number 5, number 6, and number 7. Okay, so you might have to add this bracket in on your diagram. So in this sense, there are going to be organs that are found within the ventral body cavity, which are most of your organs that you think about. And then we've got organs that are found within the dorsal body cavity, which are going to be found within your head and your cranium, or down your back in your spinal column. The brain is housed within the cranial cavity. Okay, and that space itself is called the cranial cavity, and the organ found within it is your brain. Then the spinal or vertebral cavity is going to house your spinal cord. Okay, now there's going to be protective wrappings, and there's going to be fluid, and there's going to be things that help float your brain or your spinal cord within that cavity. But where it is found is in the spinal or vertebral cavity for your spinal cord, or in the cranial cavity for your brain. On the front side, or on the ventral side of your body, the anterior side of your body, we have to separate the entire cavity into two parts. And that separation is done by your diaphragm. Okay, and it'll fully seal off the top cavity from the bottom cavity, or the chest cavity from the belly cavity. Or if we want to use our directional terms, the superior cavity from the inferior cavity. That diaphragm is just a sheet muscle. It is not a cavity itself. Okay, so just think about it as a sheet muscle that will separate the top from the bottom. The name for the entire top cavity, or the superior cavity of your ventral body cavity, is the thoracic cavity. And thoracic just means chest. So anything housed within your chest is going to be within your thoracic cavity. And then on the inferior cavity, we can have two parts, or we have two parts. Together, they are called the abdominopelvic cavity. So this blue bracket here is both number 6 and number 7 together. It's called the abdominopelvic cavity, and it is composed of abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity. So we split that up into two parts. In the abdominal cavity, you'll have your liver, gallbladder, stomach, spleen, intestines, both large and small. In your pelvic cavity, you would have your reproductive organs and your bladder. Okay, now it looks like there's a full separation here in this diagram, but there's not. This is all one thing. So the abdominopelvic cavity is kind of mixed together. Don't let that picture confuse you. Now, if we look at this from the front view, okay, so if we take a frontal section of the cavities of the body, you can see there's a little bit more going on in the thoracic cavity. The easy one is the dorsal body cavity, because it's only split up into two parts, your cranial cavity and your spinal cavity. But in the front, or the ventral body cavity, there's a little bit more going on. And so we'll first start with the abdominopelvic cavity, because that's the easier of the two, and then we'll come in here and work on the chest cavity. So the abdominopelvic cavity is your combination of the abdominal cavity plus the pelvic cavity. So we'll put abdominal for number 7, and we'll put pelvic cavity for number 8. Okay, and together those are called abdominopelvic cavity. We separate the abdominopelvic cavity from the chest cavity by the diaphragm. So we'll come in here and put diaphragm for number 6. You can see a little bit better right here that it'll fully separate the chest cavity from the belly cavity. And it's kind of housed within your rib cage just a little bit. You can see a shadow of the ribs there. Now, the thoracic cavity is all things chest. And so I want you to look at this picture first, and then we'll split it up. So when we look at all things chest, you can see that there's a lot going on. We've got a lung on either side, and the heart is situated within the middle. Here's where the thymus gland would be. Tons and tons of blood vessels coming off the top of the heart. We've got the trachea right here. And so that chest cavity is very tightly packed. And down here at the inferior portion of it, you can see the diaphragm and how it separates anything that's chest from anything that is belly. In the center of your chest cavity, or in the center of your thoracic cavity, there is an area called the mediastinum. Okay, and the mediastinum is number 3. I want you to think about it as more like this red box versus just this top triangle, because it is anything that is going to separate, or it is the region that will separate your thoracic cavity into right and left halves. So it is all of this center cavity. Think about med being middle, and it is in the middle of your thoracic cavity. Within the mediastinum, you have your pericardial cavity. And the pericardial cavity is going to be where your heart is found. The stem peri means around, and the stem card means heart. And so it is the area around your heart. Finally, on either side of that mediastinum, we have our pleural cavity. Be careful with the spelling here. It's not plural like more than one. It's not P-L-U-R-A-L. It has an E in there. And anything plural is going to relate to the lungs. You have a right and a left pleural cavity, and in it's going to be your right and your left lung. Okay, within this top part of the mediastinum, kind of that triangle shape, you've got your trachea, you've got your esophagus running down, you've got your thymus. Within that pericardial cavity, you just have your heart. And it's kind of tightly packed within that pericardial cavity. All right, if we look at this in word form, let's skip to this part in just a second. Well, let's go back. So if we look at this in word form, we're not looking at dorsal cavity versus ventral cavity, but the body can be split up into different divisions or different skeletons. And the axial skeleton is going to be like an axis. Okay, anything that runs down the center of your body or is in the vertical axis on your body. And it'll be composed of your head, your neck, and your trunk. Okay, and included within that trunk is going to be your rib cage and your backbone. Anything that is in your appendicular skeleton includes your appendages, and appendages are just your arms and legs. And it's not just the arm and the leg. It's going to include how your arm attaches to your body, or how do I make a spot for my arm to hook onto your body. And that includes the clavicle and the shoulder blade, because that forms the joint where the arm is going to be found. Same thing with the pelvis. In the appendicular skeleton, you include the leg plus the pelvis, because the pelvis gives your leg a point of attachment to your body. In the axial portion of your body is where you will have your cavities. And this is just the same thing as the picture, but in word form. We have the dorsal body cavity. Okay, remember, that's on the back side of your body. It's on the posterior portion or dorsal portion of your body. And it includes the cranial cavity and the spinal or vertebral cavity. That cranial cavity will house your brain, and the spinal cavity will house your spinal cord. The opposite of that dorsal cavity is the ventral body cavity, and it is going to be separated into a top and a bottom, or a superior and an inferior cavity by your diaphragm. The thoracic cavity contains lungs and heart, and is divided into a right and a left by the mediastinum. That mediastinum is going to split the thoracic cavity into two right and left pleural cavities, and within that mediastinum, you're going to have your pericardial cavity. The abdominopelvic cavity can be split up into two parts. It's either abdominal or pelvic, depending on what activity, the abdominopelvic cavity can be split into the abdominal and pelvic cavity depending on what organs are found within it. If it is stomach, liver, spleen, gallbladder, intestines, pancreas, kidneys, then it will be the abdominal cavity. If it is the pelvic cavity, it's mostly anything urinary related or reproductive, and even just the tail end of that large intestine. All organs within cavities, no matter if it's the dorsal cavity or the ventral cavity, are going to be called your visceral organs. I think on your stems you had VISC or VISCER, which meant organ. So anything visceral is going to relate to the organ itself. Whether we're looking at the surface of the organ or all organs within the cavity, that stem or that word is going to mean organ. Now, the next topic is all about membranes. And we're keeping the cavity idea in mind, but we've got to figure out, well, how do I protect the organs within those cavities? How do I keep them from tearing? How do I keep the friction down within the body? And you probably don't think about it, but if you bend down and get a pencil out of your book bag, or you walk up the stairs, your organs are rubbing against one another, and they are under constant friction. And so there needs to be a way to protect it, or protect all organs from tearing. And so the name for the membrane that will protect that organ is called a serous membrane. And it will secrete or make, so the word secrete means make, a very small amount of a watery substance called serous fluid. It's typically clear in the body, and there's not a lot of it. So there's not a lot of room for excess fluid or excess space in the body. But if all things are working properly, you will have just enough serous fluid to have the organs be in a frictionless environment. They always come in pairs. And so it's almost like we're going to have a first name and a last name to serous membranes. There will be one that covers the organ itself. It is wrapping around the organ. It is stuck to the outside of the organ. The name for that membrane is a visceral membrane. There's also going to be one that lines the wall of the cavity, okay, the outer perimeter of the cavity where that organ is found. And the name for that membrane, generally speaking, is a parietal membrane. Both the visceral and the parietal are serous membranes, but they are either visceral if they're wrapping the surface of the organ, or parietal if they're wrapping the wall of the cavity where the organ is found. And there is a tiny space between them. And I mean tiny. It can be millimeters. It's not a large space in the body. We don't have room for that. We don't have time for that. We don't have the energy to provide this body with ATP for that added space. We want to be as tightly packed as possible. And so the area between both the visceral and the parietal membrane is a space or a cavity. We're going to say it's either a pleural space if it's found within the pleural cavity, pericardial space if it's in the pericardial cavity, or peritoneal if it's in the abdominopelvic cavity, which we'll look at in a second. So let me go back to this picture and kind of show it to you. So here, we can't really see the heart. The heart looks like it's covered in this wax paper or white covering here. And that is the visceral pericardium, or the membrane. That is the serous membrane on the outside of the heart. And within that's going to be fluid, so that as the heart pumps repetitively over and over and over again, it's going to beat in a frictionless environment. There doesn't need to be a lot of fluid, because if there's too much, that could suffocate the heart. Or think about if there was too much fluid within this lung space or within the pleural space, then the lungs could not fill to their greatest volume, and it may interfere with gas exchange. So think about that there just needs to be a little bit of fluid in between your membranes to allow for a frictionless environment, but not too much. Okay, now the membrane types or the membrane names are going to differ depending on what cavity we are in. If we are in the pleural cavity, the name of the membrane is pleura. So the word pleural with an L on the end is an adjective. Pleura without the L is a noun. So pleura is the name of the membrane lining the cavity. The name of the cavity is the pleural cavity. Pericardium is the name for the membrane surrounding the heart. In any way, shape, or form, if it has something to do with the heart, it is the pericardium. Peri means around, card means heart. Peritoneum is anything to do with the abdominopelvic cavity. So the name for the membrane that will wrap both the organ itself and the space around the organs within the abdominopelvic cavity. And it takes a first name and a last name. So we will have both visceral and parietals of each of these. So there will be 6 membranes that you need to know: visceral pleura and parietal pleura, visceral pericardium, parietal pericardium, visceral peritoneum, and parietal peritoneum. So you will choose, depending on what we're looking at, or what are we wrapping, what are we lining, and create both visceral and parietal of each of these. Okay, the best way to see it is to draw a picture. And so what I have is just a little t-shirt, but this is going to represent your front body cavity or your ventral body cavity. So we'll start with separating the ventral body cavity into a superior portion and an inferior portion, and that's done by the diaphragm. So I'm going to draw in here a diaphragm, which is just a sheet muscle that separates the thoracic cavity from the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, we're going to work with organs next. You don't need colors yet, so just hang on, draw this in pencil. This is representing a lung, and this is representing a lung. So either one of these are going to be in your pleural cavities. In the center, we have a mediastinum. So this space between the lungs would be your mediastinum. Within that mediastinum, we have a pericardial cavity. Within the pericardial cavity is your heart. All things inferior are your abdominopelvic cavity, and this is my little intestine that we're going to add in the abdominopelvic cavity. Okay, so you're going to want to take 6 colors. I'm going to try my best to do this with my mouse. 6 colors, and we're going to write in the names of our membranes and draw them in. Okay, so let's start with abdominopelvic because it's the easiest. Okay, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to line my abdominopelvic cavity with an outer membrane. Okay, so I'm going to come in and line the wall of this cavity with blue here. Try my best to do this as neatly as possible. Okay, and the name for this, since it is on the wall, is parietal. And since I'm in the abdominopelvic cavity, it is peritoneum. Okay, so we will change this to blue. And this blue line is going to represent your parietal peritoneum because it is lining the wall of the cavity. And which cavity am I in? The abdominopelvic cavity, so it is peritoneum. Now, they always come in pairs, so we're going to do the same thing, but now we're going to wrap around the organ itself, stuck to the organ. I'm going to change my color, and I'm going to stick or adhere this membrane as best I can to the surface of the organ, and it is not going to be my parietal peritoneum, it is going to be my visceral peritoneum because visceral means organ. Peritoneum tells me that that organ is found within the abdominopelvic cavity. So I've got a visceral peritoneum right there. Okay. Now we're going to do the same thing in the thoracic cavity, but now we got to worry about two parts. We got to worry about the lung, we got to worry about the heart. So lining the surface of the lung is going to be another membrane. And lining that surface of the lung, since I'm stuck to the lung, is visceral. And the name for that membrane, since it is lung related, is pleura. Okay, I'm going to do it on both. Wow. There we go. Sorry, I'm trying to do this with my mouse. Okay, so lining that organ itself is the visceral pleura. Okay, you would not say visceral pleural, okay, because that's an adjective, it's two adjectives. You would tell me visceral pleural membrane or just visceral pleura. Okay, on either side of the lung or lining the wall where that lung is found, you will have a parietal pleura. And so we'll have to be careful here to make this all fit. But around that lung, you will also have a little space, so the pleural space between the two membranes, and you will have a parietal pleura. Now this is exaggerated. Okay, the space between the two membranes here is exaggerated because it's hard to draw, but there is a tiny space between each membrane, between my purple and green here, or between my visceral pleura and my parietal pleura. But the area between the two is the pleural space, and the green is not my visceral pleura, but my parietal pleura. Okay, because parietal means wall. And the last two are the pericardiums. And we'll have both a parietal pericardium around the heart and a visceral pericardium attached directly to the heart. So we'll draw in my parietal pleura or parietal pericardium first. Just going to try to make it like a box. Okay, since it's lining the wall around the heart, it is parietal. And since it is in the pericardial space, it is called pericardium. So this is my parietal pericardium. And then we'll have the same thing touching the heart, attached directly to the heart. And it is your visceral pericardium. I'm trying to make this a little bit smaller. super tightly packed in there, but that's how it really is. Okay, again, there's no need for extra space in the body. And this one here would be your visceral pericardium. Okie dokie. So it's kind of a visual for how that would go. Now, there's more organs down here in the abdominopelvic cavity, and the same idea would apply to all the other organs. The liver would be wrapped in visceral peritoneum, the pancreas, the spleen, all of the intestines. So everything, stomach, everything that's in this cavity follows the same rules. Now, just a little clinical note, if there's an issue, okay, what happens if you get sick, or we've talked about the appendix a lot already. What if that appendix ruptures and all of that gross bacteria is spilled into the belly? What would that do to the membranes itself? How would that cause issue? Or what would happen if we made too much serous fluid? Okay, now there's a chance for that. And so there's 3 conditions that can arise based on inflammation or swelling or infection of the serous membranes. And it's either going to be pericarditis, okay, the stem itis means inflammation. If the pericardium, remember, which is the wrapping around the heart, gets inflamed, you can get pericarditis. And that's a pretty serious condition, because if you start inflaming or in your mind think swelling the tissue around the heart, then that's going to suffocate the heart or interfere with how the heart can beat. And so they would have to treat that quickly before the heart has palpitations or has abnormal rhythms or can eventually stop. In the belly cavity or in the abdominopelvic cavity, you can end up with peritonitis. Okay, and all of this extra pink and white and inflamed looking tissue is the peritoneum that is inflamed. If your appendix ruptures and all of that bacteria spills into your abdominopelvic cavity, you can end up with peritonitis, which is super painful, and they have to give you a pretty high dose of antibiotic to treat that. And there's 2 issues with the pleura. You can end up with pleuritis or pleurisy. If you have pleurisy and they listen to your lungs with a stethoscope, it's going to sound crunchy. It's going to sound like it just hurts to breathe in, and it does. If you have pleuritis, it is inflammation of the pleura, and you can end up with excess fluid within your chest cavity. And if you fill that chest cavity with fluid, obviously the lungs could not fill as they should, and you can have trouble breathing. They can give you medication to drain that fluid, or they can even go in and drain it themselves with a tube if they need to and if it's bad enough. But just some ways to think about, well, cool, these are membranes, but what might happen if, or why are they important, or how would disease affect the interaction between the visceral and the parietal membranes?